Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Crime Entertainment. I have here today a very interesting guest, former member of the MC, the Vagos, former Mongol, and now he's actually a counselor trying to, set kids on the right path. Please welcome to Crime and Entertainment, Mooch. Mooch, how you doing, my friend?
Good, man. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate you asking me to be on.
Oh man, I couldn't wait to get you on because these stories I think are always interesting. People that, get involved in the outlaw culture. I think, a lot of people live vicariously through TV shows and stuff like that. But then to come full circle, to come back and then try to keep, kids and the younger generation from making those same mistakes. I love those types of stories because there's no better teacher than someone who's been there and done that.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, kids today are, I think a lot of them can see through bullshit. So if you got somebody telling me, hey, don't do this, don't do that, and I can look at you and tell you that you've probably never even done any of the shit, like you don't really know where I'm coming from, it's not going to resonate. But if you know somebody has been through the shit like you have and it's documented, it's there, then they're much more apt to listen to your advice because they know that you've been there and done that. So I'm glad you could come on, man. I think we're gonna have a good show. Uh to start off, Mooch, how do you get that name?
So I got that name when I was in the Vagos, actually. Was at a camp out. It was like one of the first big camp outs I'd been on in the Vagos. So I hadn't had a nickname yet. I was pretty new to the club. Um, and I was sitting there at the campfire hanging out, and my chapter president came in and he was like, "Man, you're already eating?" And I was like, "Yeah, Barry made me this." Or I think it was Glenn. And then he's like, "Man, who gave you that chair?" I was like, "Oh, Glenn gave it to me." He's like, "Didn't I get you that hat?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Man, you're a fucking mooch." And that was it, man. He was like, "Hey, go introduce yourself to all the new chapters and let them know, or all the new members, and let them know who you are." And so it just stuck. And, I'd walk into a campground and be like, "Hey, what's up? I'm Mooch from the Border Town Vagos." And they'd be like, "Mooch, huh? What do you need? A drink, beer, want some food?" So I never went hungry, and and it paid out
Yeah.
all right. So
Not a bad nickname there, I guess, to get stuck with. And that's all it takes. Somebody says that one time, and then it just sticks, and it's never.
yep, for sure. And I think it's one of those that's not, I mean, there's been like moochers and different kind of nicknames over the years in different clubs, but it's not a super common one like, spiders and, and snipers
Right.
and all that type of stuff.
Yeah.
So, it just kind of stuck, and then it just carried along with me all through life.
Okay. So now, early in life, you grew up in the Oregon area, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. I grew up in Salem, Oregon, right? It's about an hour outside of Portland.
And you were into like the punk rock scene early in life.
Yeah, so I grew up like playing every sport that existed. My parents are, and my whole family is like school teachers and sports coaches. So I
Okay.
played little league and pee wee football, and then I got really into wrestling and some boxing, and wrestled all through high school. But then after that, yeah, I started getting really into like punk rock and skinhead, the anti-racist skinhead scene, and then ended up joining a band and touring all over the country and really being involved in that scene.
So the anti-racist. Now, I think I've heard you use the term before in one of your previous interviews, sharks.
Sharp, yeah, sharp,
Shark, yeah, and that's what skinheads against racial prejudice.
correct.
Okay,
And we
so
never necessarily claimed to be sharp just because that was more of a political aspect. But we were definitely anti-racist, and we did most of our time fighting with the neo-Nazis and the racist skinheads.
what was kind of like the? Obviously, I know some of what their belief system was, but the groups that you were with, I mean, what was kind of like some of the things that drove y'all? I mean, what did y'all believe in? What did
Well,
you enjoy?
yeah, the skinhead movement was a lot just like the punk rock movement at first. I mean, it was, inspired by music and fashion, and it was just kind of a culture for young kids. It was really big in England, and then, a lot of it had like a Jamaican West Indian influence from old reggae. So it was kind of a multicultural subculture, really, like just a music movement. And then it got so big just because of the menacing look, and then, the violence that went with it. It was really big in the media in the 80s. And then so different political parties ended up trying to, utilize these guys for their own sake. So it ended up being kind of synonymous with the right wing skinheads and racism. So those that weren't into the racism, we called ourselves traditional skinheads because we were involved in the scene that's about just the dress code and the music. And then the racist skinheads kind of gave us all a bad name, right? So whether people were like politically anti-racist or just against the idea and everything else, we ended up fighting with the other guys because they didn't really fit into our scene. It wasn't, they were in a wholly different movement altogether.
Right. Now, you actually played an instrument too, or you were in a band, right?
Yeah, yeah. I played guitar in a band called The Escaped, and we toured the country for about 5 years. We put out 3 different records and did some work tours and played at CBGB's and Gilman Street. It's pretty cool places.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty. I mean, looking back, I mean, I don't want to jump too far, of course, but like looking back, was there ever a time that you wish maybe you would have stuck with that and stayed at that, or was it just something that you were
No,
doing?
I think it was cool to do at the time, man. I was in my early 20s. And I was, in a van. We'd be out like on the road for 1 month, 2 months at a time. Then we come home for a month. And I was just always on the road traveling. And it'd be really hard to do, I think, as an adult with a career and other stuff. But at the time, it was just me and a bunch of friends my age traveling the country and having fun. So I think it worked out perfect for what it was. Trying to break through and kind of live off that type of lifestyle would be tough. The
Yeah.
time when I used to do it, things were cheap, man. We each got paid $5 a day, and I could eat off that. I couldn't even imagine that now. So no, I think it worked out. It gave me some really cool life experiences. I met amazing friends, and I'm still friends with to this day. I got to see the whole country, so it was really cool. But as far as like sticking it out, I don't think it would have panned out.
Now, what was like I mean, I guess you could consider that a gang for sure, but like, what was like the first like serious gang that you got involved with?
Yeah, I would say that's the Rose City Bobber Boys was the name of our skinhead gang, and it was pretty serious. I mean, some of the guys had killed the neo-Nazi with the lead singer of the band called Bound for Glory, and so that was pretty big and important. It was all in the media. We got some pretty violent altercations with the Hammerskins and Volksfront. So the only thing that I would say, I mean, what separated us from like maybe being a gang or what the definition of a gang would be is we didn't profit. Like there was no money, people weren't hustling. But outside of that, I mean, we had a uniform, we were claiming territory, we kept other skinhead groups out of our area. I mean, we were organized and had meetings and all that stuff. So it was pretty similar to what most people would consider a gang for sure.
Okay. Now, what was your first motorcycle gang? Like your entrance into that world?
Yeah, I joined a motorcycle club. I joined the outside. I started hanging around with the outsiders. So I didn't know, all I knew about motorcycle clubs is what I read in books or saw in movies. And, I'd see guys out and about, but it wasn't like a culture I knew a lot about. And, it was pretty intimidating and overwhelming. And I ended up meeting a guy that was in a local club there in Portland called the Outsiders. And they'd been a club in Portland since like the 60s. They're one of the oldest clubs in that area. So they had a really strong history and tradition of like old school biker values. And since I was so intrigued with that lifestyle, I started really spending a lot of time with those guys and hanging out with them. I never made it to a member status, but that's who I first started hanging out with and spending time with and learning a lot from about the lifestyle.
Okay. Now, were they a 1% club?
They wear a 1% diamond now, but they weren't back then, or they didn't claim it back then. They have a 3-piece patch on their bottom rocker reads Portland, but they didn't wear a 1% diamond back then.
Okay. Now, how long were you with the Outsiders till you transferred to the Vagos?
I was only with the Outsiders for a couple months. Like I said, I was just kind of hanging around, getting to know them more. Had just started prospecting and had prospected for about a month when I ended up taking a job and moving out of state and moving to Nevada. So then I was like not in any club for several months there until I ended up meeting the Vagos, and then I ended up joining the Vagos down in Nevada.
Now, was there a prospecting phase for the Vagos?
Typically, yes, there wasn't for me for the fact of there was kind of the loophole that I came from another club, even though I wasn't really a member. But the president was, he had his way to kind of work things out. And then we was a charter member of a new chapter. So, sometimes most clubs, well, I guess that's different per club, but a lot of clubs will give people a probationary full patch if they charter a new chapter. So I was a member of the Bordertown chapter. So I was still on a probationary status for 2 years. So I wasn't a full member, but I also wasn't a prospect.
So, like, was there any beef between the Outsiders and the Vagos? I mean, was there any beef because you switched, or was it kind of?
It was pretty cool. The Outsiders only had 2 chapters in the Midwest or in the Northwest. They're pretty small, and there was not much overlap. Like there wasn't Vagos in the areas the Outsiders were. So it wasn't necessarily like I left one for the other. It was more, I wasn't in the region anymore. I wasn't in the area, and so I ended up going with the club that was in the area I was in.
Okay. Now, how long were you with the Vagos?
Just short of 2 years.
Just short of 2 years. Now, what rank did you get to in the Vagos?
I was just a regular member.
Just a regular member.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, compare the difference between like, I don't want to jump to the Mongols quite yet, but like, because the Vagos are a pretty big club. It's maybe some of them that wouldn't be the one that jumps off the page. Obviously, your people are going to know the Outlaws and the Hells Angels and the Banditos and the Mongols, but the Vagos was a serious club. I mean, compare like their structure to the Mongols. Like, what was the biggest difference that jumps off the page?
At the time the Vagos weren't as big as they were now. They,
Right.
since then it's been several years, so this was like 2005 when I was around. So, since then they've expanded all over the country. They're very well known. They've had some altercations with some major clubs. They've been in the media.
Mhm.
They've grown a lot. And at the time they were more of a Southern California based club. There were some of them in Southern Oregon and then some in Nevada. There are a couple of small chapters here and there outside of that, but they were really just a lot smaller club. They didn't wear 1%er diamond. They didn't consider themselves a 1%er club. They didn't wear a 3-piece patch. But the Vagos have a really long history too. They were a club in Southern California for a very long time. Um, I think culturally it was a little different. There was a lot more of like the older guys, more of like that kind of old school biker vibe. They wore the denim and they had like a lot of the long gray hair, like old school biker dudes, where the Mongols, had, by the time I joined, had a lot more street culture in it, a lot more Hispanic influence. And the Vagos do now too. So it's tough to compare, but um, it's tough to say, man. I think the biggest thing was like the structure and the leadership was a lot different at the time when I was in the Vagos.
Right.
When I was in the skinhead scene, one of the things I didn't like with our group is if you got in trouble, the gang would beat you up, and if you violated a rule, you get beat up. And if we were out hanging out and partying, I never knew which one of the members might beat one, but someone guy might punch somebody else, and you never knew what was going to happen. And the outsiders told me that they had a rule that there was one brother could never hit. There's nothing two brothers couldn't talk about that would have to result in violence. So they could always sit down and talk, and they weren't allowed to hit each other. And I was told that was a situation with the Vagos, and ended up not being the case. And there was a brother that had been killed, and I can't say for sure who did it or what, but it was there was some question, and then there was started to be kind of some internal beef where chapters were fighting chapters, and that's what kind of made me want to get out of there. And when I joined the Mongols definitely have that rule as well, that we're not allowed to fight each other or hit each other. So kind of resonated more with my beliefs and where I wanted to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, that kind of takes away from the whole aspect of joining something like that, which is, a brotherhood that you would want to think they would have your back, not gonna hit you over the fucking head or something if you do something wrong. I mean,
Absolutely. And I mean, a lot of the issue was this was when I was back in Oregon in the Vagos, but there was 2 chapters in a relatively close area. There wasn't any sort of state leadership to kind of squash any sort of issue. So it was just like chapter P's were on an equal level. And so, one chapter, like this other chapter was taking, some guys that maybe washed out of our chapter, or a prospect that didn't work. So there was all these little things that ended up turning into a big issue. And because there wasn't, any sort of state or national leadership that was getting involved, you can imagine how things ended up getting worked out. And so, it kind of ended up getting, boiling over. And a lot of us decided this wasn't something we wanted to be a part of.
okay. Now, when you went from the Vagos to the Mongols, was there any pushback for that?
Yeah, that didn't go smooth at all. So, like I said, I had gone to my chapter president at the time of the Vagos Magpie, and we sat down to lunch, and I just told him like, hey, dude, I'm really thinking about leaving, and this isn't really a good fit for me. And he had come from another small club before the Vagos too. So he said, hey, man, I don't want to be bouncing around from club to club. If I ever join another club, it would only be the Mongols. That would be it. And when I was in a Vago in Nevada, I had met some Mongols too, and I was on that same page. And so we got the chapter together, and we talked about initially we were all going to patch over. Now, a couple of the guys saw that as kind of their chance to take the reins in leadership, and said one thing to us and one thing to other people. So some stayed and some left. But eventually I ended up, so there was a handful of us in Oregon that patched over. I took some guys with me in Vegas and Reno. And then shortly after, probably 2 months after joining, I brought over the whole Reading chapter too. So several Vagos came with me. So you can imagine that it wasn't just that the fact that I left and joined another club. I took guys with me too. So, it wasn't meant as disrespect, but obviously it was a pretty disrespectful move, or it was taken disrespectfully.
Right. Yeah, that even that's where you started getting some threats on your life there when that happened, right?
Right. Yeah. The FBI came to my house or my parents' house and had let us know that they said they had an informant within the Vagos and that they had a credible threat on me and my brother's life. Um, and thankfully nothing came of it. And honestly, at the time, man, I was so new to that biker world and everything. I'm still a 26-year-old kid from the punk rock scene. I just thought it was bullshit. I mean, I was like, oh, that's probably this cop's way of trying to get us to talk or whatever.
Yeah.
As time progressed and stuff, who knows if it was serious or enough, but the tension was serious for sure. There was definitely issues.
Well, that's definitely a tool or a tactic that they would use. Hey, your life's in danger. We can help you. And then it just, how that story unfolds. It goes
Absolutely.
depending on how hip people are to the tactics that law enforcement uses. When you came into the Mongols, what was the landscape like at this time? Was Doc heading over that, or had he already been
No,
out?
Doc was still around. He was doing this really heavy recruitment drive. I often say that, there's a lot of agreements between motorcycle clubs, and for a long time, there's usually one between all the major ones. And I know we've had a lot of or the Mongols had a lot of agreements with the Vagos. They wouldn't take each other's members. And I think the reason I was able to come in when I did is because Doc was essentially, for lack of a better term, was just taking everybody that wanted to join, really. And so we were able to kind of come in under Doc, under that blanket. But when I first came in, we were the Oregon guys. There were 6 of us. We were like some of the very few white people in the whole club. The club was still majority largely Hispanic. There was still some of those guys that Doc had brought in that weren't really riding motorcycles, but that wasn't as common as the media made it out to be. There were some guys there for sure, but a lot of us were still bikers. A lot of dudes were still joining because they loved motorcycles, but it hadn't expanded like the Mongols are now. They weren't in all the different states. They were in a few out of states. They were still big in Oklahoma and Nevada and a little bit out east, but just not much. So I think it was a lot smaller club when I had joined.
Had the Laughlin riot already happened by the time you joined?
Yeah, that was 2002. I joined in 2007.
Okay, so I'm assuming the Billy Queen infiltration had already happened as well.
That had already happened, but even though it was several years past, it was still a main thing talked about a lot, for a long time. And getting to know some of the guys that went through it, and because that's one of the books I read. Remember when I was saying I didn't know anything about motorcycle clubs? That was one of the first books I read. Everyone did. I think that was a really popular book.
Oh yeah, I don't know. Like, I mean, there is a Charlie Sheen movie where he goes undercover in a biker gang. I've heard that's supposedly loosely based on it. I don't really know how factual that might be to that, but I mean, I recently I had the hardcover of Under and Alone, but man, I stay so fucking busy. Sometimes it's hard to sit down and read an actual book, but it came out on audiobook, and so I can burn through an audiobook day at work. And I mean, it was really good. I mean, like, I don't even know who the narrator was, but I mean, he done a really good job at putting you in the setting. And so many times, like, he about got found out. I mean, he kept referencing this guy, Red Dog, that just knew he was a fucking cop.
Yeah, and that was the thing too, is meeting Red Dog and meeting all those guys. A lot of those guys that were referenced in the book. That was kind of that era I was coming in. Those guys were still around, or some of them were still around. So that was pretty cool. I think that Charlie Sheen movie is based off the Dirty Dozen, I believe. But one interesting fact about Billy Queen's book is Mel Gibson actually had bought the rights to it at one point.
I heard that, but he hasn't done anything with it.
I think the Black Rain raids and everything kind of messed a lot of things up, because there was a lot of issues with the Mongols trademark and property patents, or their property, intellectual property and stuff like that. So I don't know if that played a role in it or not. But yeah, initially they were like, he was supposedly was in talks with Doc about using some Mongols as extras and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, who knows why that never came, but like, I would have thought that Mel would have hopped on that. I mean, people might have their own, feelings about Mel and some things that he said or done in the past, but he's really good when it comes into focusing in on a certain subject matter, the movies. I mean, even something out of the box as Passion of the Christ, which was awesome. I mean, I think he would have done a really good job, whether he was in it or not, even if he was directing.
Right. Well, and another thing too at the time is Doc, I came in towards the end of the Doc era. So, around that time I was joining, Doc was really heavy and pushing into the media, trying to get the Mongols name out there. One of the very first big parties I went to was the Harbor chapter in Los Angeles. And that was when they were filming for Gangland. And I remember Doc getting up in front of everyone saying, "Hey, we're doing this documentary, and if anyone wants to be in it, go stand on this line. If you don't, be over here." And so some of those guys obviously were in leadership and were in it because of that. But then there was guys that were just in it because they wanted to be on TV.
Yeah.
And I that's with all due respect. I'm not saying anything negative, but I mean, everyone had the choice on who wanted to do it, who didn't. And they sat there and filmed right there while we were at that party. Then that Man of Mayhem, or Masters of Mayhem, Masters of Mayhem came out on National Geographic, and that had like Junior and Red Dog, and that was more based off the Billy Queen stuff. But there was a lot of that stuff hitting right around that time. And then of course Doc's book. So
yeah, I read his book was Respect Few, Fear None, right? I think was the
name. It was Honor Few, Fear None. So the Mongol slogan is Respect Few, Fear None. And the Mongols own the copyright to it, and they didn't give it to Doc for his book title, so he had to come up with his own.
Oh, so that's why he tweaked it a little bit. Okay.
Yeah.
I remember, because the tattoo that they get is Respect Few, Fear None, but his book was okay. All right, that's right.
Yeah, there's a chapter within the Mongols that has the trademark to that slogan. It's a slogan they've had for a very long time, so he couldn't use it without their permission, and the club wasn't going to give it to him.
I mean, what is your opinion on Doc? Because like when people watch those documentaries, basically they see that when he took over, he was trying to, I guess you could say, strengthen the Mongols. So it was real relaxed on the stringent code that maybe that culture had always kind of had of you need to, prospect for a year or longer in some cases. A lot of that wasn't going on. Like you mentioned, some of the people that were coming in weren't even guys that rode bikes. There was talks and rumors of Liame being, involved in there. What is your opinion on Doc and the way he handled?
Well, I mean, I was only under him for about a year. I would say that he came in under a pretty changing landscape. Like those guys that we read about in Billy Queen's book, you know, most of those dudes were spun out on meth, riding choppers. They barely left the area. I mean, they weren't. They were the old school biker type, the type of people you think of when you think biker. And Doc really changed the Mongols when it came to the type of membership they got. And like you said, there's some negatives with that, but there's a lot of positives. There's a lot of guys that were similar to me, like they grew up in a gang environment or something like that, and they kind of were graduating out of it and wanted somewhere to go. So he just really expanded the club. I think that was good. He really some of the things he was very structured. So like the militant structure, the game face, security protocols, all that. I think that was all positive. And when I met him, man, he seemed, he knew my name right out the gate, and he knew who I was. He knew, like, because he reviewed the applications before they came in and stuff. He was buying t-shirts at events. So, I mean, my first impression was pretty good. I mean, I'm sure you can tell from those interviews and stuff, he's a pretty personable guy. You can kind of tell why he was in leadership. Yeah. But then he ended up getting caught stealing money and thrown out of the club. He didn't get permission to write his book. Essentially was profiting off the club, since this whole book is mainly about the club more than anything. And then he switched the club's trademark into his own name. And so when he got busted in that Black Rain racketeering, he part of his plea bargain was he signed over the club's Mongol trademark to the federal government. So
that's why they were able to take the patch.
Okay. Exactly. Yep. That was the loophole in which they were able to get it.
I was wondering how that happened, because that's the only one on record, at least that I know of, that they were able to completely take.
It was kind of a combination of bad things, right? Like the trademark had lapsed. It was in an individual's name instead of being a collective membership mark. It was things that Doc, he was in charge of keeping all that stuff, and he wasn't doing it correctly. And so, but yeah, so essentially he had ownership of it and he gave it away. Now, obviously the Mongols beat that in court, but it took a very long time. I don't know, just because I haven't read the paperwork and stuff. I don't know if he testified on anybody in trial, but I mean, he openly said he would be willing to cooperate, and he handed over the patch and everything else. So I don't look on him favorably. I don't have a strong opinion for Doc, but I would say that, he probably did some good things before that happened.
Right. And he's not in the system right now of any prison system. I don't even know if anyone really knows where he is right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know.
So when you were with them, whatever happened to his son, just out of curiosity? Little Rube?
Yeah, they all got kicked out around the same time.
Okay.
His brother and his son were in the same chapter. And so initially Doc, before he got kicked out, he was, he stepped down from National P, and he was trying to create his own chapter. And he essentially wanted a chapter that didn't wear side rockers, didn't answer to anybody, where they traveled around so he can do his book signings and have some security and maybe help new chapters start. But he kind of wanted to just run his own program. Mm-hmm. And the presidents of the Mongols said, no, we're not going to do that. And it's kind of a little bit of an issue. And he essentially, the way I looked at it is, he took his ball and went home, said, F this, right? He backed out. And then, once leadership changed and people start going over the books and this and that, I mean, it started coming to light on what was really going on. So anyone that was really tight with him, his family and stuff, they kind of went with him too. And they all got busted in Black Rain as well. And they also all signed plea bargains and everything else.
So what area were you mainly out of when you were with the Mongols? What area were you living in? Still Nevada?
No, so when I joined the Mongols, we started the very first chapter in Oregon. I've actually, between me and my brother, probably started just about every chapter in Oregon and Washington. Then when I was going to school, I was doing my undergrad, I was in Whittier. So I was in Mother chapter there, and then I chartered the Fullerton chapter. When I was during Black Rain, right before Black Rain, I was in San Diego chapter. And then I moved out here to the Midwest about 6 years ago and started a lot of chapters out here before I ended up leaving the club. So I've kind of been around a little bit, but primarily the first several years were out of Oregon.
Okay. If you don't mind me asking, what was your undergrad for?
My undergrad's in social and behavioral studies, and then my master's is in social work.
Okay. Wow. So when you started up that new chapter, was there any other MCs in the area?
Yeah. So Oregon has a really strong history of there only being like 3 or 4 major clubs, and they don't let other. Or back then, they weren't allowing other clubs to join in that area. They had agreements with other clubs that no one else would start there. So it was a pretty tumultuous time. That we were not well welcomed. The outsiders obviously took some things pretty personally. I'd been with them. I left, and then I came back in a bit different club in their own area. And so yeah, we were definitely 100% not welcome there, and things were pretty tense there for a while.
I think people don't get people that aren't necessarily in tune with the biker culture, have like very little knowledge about it. They don't realize like how many rules are in play. Like, you've just said, Doc was going over your application. So there are steps to transfer clubs. They do have a structure, president, VP, treasurer, sergeant of arms. It is very structured. Territory is a huge thing. So like you said, moving to a new place, starting a new chapter, that can cause some serious problems, if not all out war. And it has in many cases, especially between like, the warlocks and outlaws down in Florida. I mean, that was bombings and shit every day. So I don't think people really get how much that what they may consider, because they're not from that culture, trivial, how much that really matters in the world of
Yeah,
outlaw.
I mean, there's more rules in the outlaw club world than there's anything you do in your civilian life for sure. And in fact, it's probably more close in line with something like the military, something like that. It's very structured. There's bylaws. There's consequences for breaking rules, whether it's a fine or whatever. There's sometimes you have to get disciplined back to prospects. So, I mean, there's rules. I'll tell you what happens if you break the rules, and then like you said too, there's also rules between clubs or agreements, and I guess agreements is a better way to put it. There's also a lot of agreements and like old agreements between clubs on territory and who's going to be where and who's allowed in what state.
Mhm.
It's changed a lot over the years, but I mean, traditionally that was the main thing.
Who was the next top guy after Doc? Was that little Dave, or was there somebody in between Doc and him?
Now there was a couple in between that the national sergeant at the time took over when Doc stepped down, but then he was hemmed up in the raids, so he was only in for a little bit. I mean, he was in the club for a long time. He was only leadership for a little bit. Then the secretary took over because he was next in command that didn't get busted in the raids, and he was in for less than a year. And then they had elections, and it goes Dave. So within like about a short 2 year period, there was a couple, but Dave was the P pretty much right then and since then.
And you and him were pretty tight, right?
We got tight for sure. We weren't. I didn't know anything about him when he was in 10 years before me, and obviously being in Oregon, I didn't know a lot of California brothers. And then when after I got arrested and went through my court stuff, and I got put on non-association, wasn't allowed to hang out at the club, and I kept violating for doing it. So I moved to San Diego. So I got to know a lot of the Dago guys, and started to get know more people. But I still didn't really get to know Dave. I got to know Dave just from eventually I became in state leadership and he was the national boss. So we just worked together. Him and I started a lot of chapters together. I have to get his permission before I could start chapters. And then it got to the point where we were doing like major sit downs or doing sit downs with any of the big major clubs. It was usually me or him doing them. So yeah, we were really close within the club, but we didn't really get tight and become really good friends for the last couple of years. I mean, we've always gotten along, but I'd never been to his house or his birthday parties or anything like that until after.
So you say you were state leadership. So what all does that entail, if you can share with our audience? But
Yeah, so kind of like what I was talking about with the Vago issue, where it's just chapter P, so there was no one like in the state that could oversee stuff or like help out. Me and little Dave developed a program called the State Rep Program. So I guess it started out as regional reps, even it's not even per state, but like so for Oregon, Washington, so like the Northwest, I would help oversee the chapters, and it wasn't necessarily like a boss per se, but it was like making sure everyone's following the rules, the protocols, someone that if they needed to go to another chapter, they could just go through me instead of going back and forth. If they wanted to start a new chapter, it would have to go through me first, which I'd have to run it up the flagpole too. So it's more of just kind of a structural organizational thing, so that everyone was still running the same program, that there was oversight, and then direct communication with mother chapters. So we called that state rep, or lack of a better term would be state boss. But like I said, he wasn't really a boss of anything.
so what was your highest rank with the Mongols?
Regional rep. I oversaw Oregon, Washington. When I moved out here, I oversaw the Midwest. I oversaw a lot of the out of state or out of country chapters for quite a while. Since I'd helped start Australia, and then when some of these European and other chapters kicked off, I was helping oversee them, just mainly because I was in communication with a lot of them and I had the time to do it. So yeah, just regional and state rep, I guess.
Now, eventually you did decide to walk away from the Mongols. What year was
Yes.
that?
It was the end. Well, it was just, let's see, the end of 20, it was December of 2021. So it was a month after my 14th club anniversary.
Oh wow. So I mean, not too terribly long ago.
No.
So I mean, what led to that decision? Because total, you were in what, you said 14 years.
10 years, yeah.
What was the ultimate thing that led you to do that? I mean, obviously, when you first started, there's kind of a whirlwind of the club, like you said. Black Rain came down. A lot of people, went down for that. Did they not get infiltrated again later on?
That was Black Rain. Black Rain had 4 undercover ATF agents,
Okay, all right.
and like a dozen informants. That was the big one. That was the big one in 2008 that happened. Yeah, that first year was crazy, man. So I joined this new club. I moved to the state. Every club in the state doesn't want me there. Then I get notified that another club's got a contract out of my life. Right. Shortly thereafter that, another major California organization is rumored to have issues with the Mongols. I didn't know anything about that or that life, so that that was going on. And then then I got arrested in March for following those cops, and they charged me with attempted kidnapping, conspiracy to kidnapping. So I was in jail for 2 months while I fought a pretty heavy trial. Then I moved to San Diego, and then right after that, Black Rain hit. So I mean, all the things that usually happen like in the 10-year span of a club, I got in the first 10 months.
Jesus Christ. Now you expand on that a little bit. You were following cops and then they tried to charge you with kidnapping?
Yeah, man. So it was an ATF agent, and then a Eugene police detective, but he was like the head of the motorcycle gang investigators unit. So they had some, unbeknownst to me at the time, they had some informants in and around in my chapter around me. So they were keeping an eye on things. They were actually working on building part of the Black Rain case in Oregon. So they were doing a lot of surveillance. Right around this time, there was a big paper in the Oregonian, which was the Oregon newspaper, about the Mongols being established in Oregon and how all these other clubs were essentially supposedly at war with us. And tensions were high, right? I mean, everyone was paying attention to things. And I was living on my parents' property. They own about 140 acres out in the country. And I was in a pickup truck coming down my driveway. It's about a half a mile driveway, private lane, and an all black SUV Ford Explorer was coming towards me. And when they saw me, they turned around, they took off. So I followed them. And they eventually initially went south. So I was following them south, and then they went north. So then I kept following them. And then they went to the Gypsy Jokers Clubhouse, which is that's the biggest club in Oregon. And that's who the rumors were to be that we had issues with. And they sat out front of the Gypsy Jokers Clubhouse. So you can imagine I thought that they were probably enemy or someone out to hurt me. Then they got back on the interstate and headed south. So then I was worried they were going to go back towards my house. So at this point, I made some phone calls and got some other Mongols in the interstate in their cars, because I couldn't. Anytime I tried to get up next to them, they would take off or slow down. Like they wouldn't let me look in to see who they were. So my thought process initially was, well, maybe I can get someone else out on the road that they're not expecting, and we can at least look in, who are these people, or were they familiar? What do they look like? We followed them for about an hour, and eventually I was like, you know what, I've had about enough of this. Let's figure out who these guys are. So we boxed them in and started to kind of pull them over, and we did. They hit their lights and sirens, and it turned out it was cops. So I was convinced I hadn't done really anything wrong, that wasn't going to be in that much trouble. And, initially they said, oh, we didn't know what we're charging with. And then it was, oh, it's attempted assault. And it was kind of a joke. Everyone obviously lawyered up, but I knew that these guys, I was worried these guys were going to try some shady stuff. So I actually sat there during the interrogation and just kept saying things like, how come you didn't identify yourselves as police officers? How come you didn't, call for backup? And in fact, I think that the interrogation of me was so damaging for them that the state government wouldn't let them use that in our trial, actually, which is pretty. Yeah, but I mean, it's pretty crazy, right? I mean, normally that's what they use in trial.
Yeah.
So they kept it out of the trial. And then, so then they ended up deciding they were charging us with conspiracy to commit kidnapping and attempted kidnapping, since they had moved from one lane to another and forcefully moved someone in a direction they didn't want to go.
Right.
And I was at a $14 million bail, and then they lowered it to 1.4 million.
Damn.
I was in single cell. My crime was against law enforcement, so I was in single cell for 23 half an hours a day for just over 2 months. They offered me some plea bargains, was all prison time, and like I said, I didn't feel like I'd done anything wrong, so I denied. I didn't take any of them, and I took it to a jury trial, and I ended up getting found not guilty of everything other than some misdemeanors: reckless driving, reckless endangerment, and menacing.
Wow.
But the judge obviously was pretty pissed that I got found not guilty. So she gave me the state maximum and everything, which she gave me a felony probation for misdemeanor charges. So I had 5 years probation with a 9 p.m. curfew. And the biggest part was that I wasn't allowed to affiliate with the club. And I did. And every time I did, I got caught. I mean, not every time I did, but I got caught a lot. And I ended up doing probably about a year on and off, going back and forth for these probation violations.
What could you have gotten?
Who knows? It could have been a really, really long time, man.
Yeah, kidnapping in and of itself, like you said, can be as simple as not letting someone get out of the car. That net is very wide when it comes to kidnapping. It's not physically, tying someone up, throwing them in your car, and taking them somewhere else. It can just be something as simple as not letting somebody leave a premises of somewhere.
Right. Or if I push you from the sidewalk to the street, I moved you in a direction you didn't want to go.
Yeah,
That's
that
what they
that
call
net is very wide.
But there was a ton of charges. They had unlawful use of a weapon, since so they said my vehicle was a weapon. I mean, a lot of pretty big reach stuff that thankfully, they didn't get. I could have gotten over a decade in prison at least, for sure, probably quite a bit more. The plea bargain they offered me was 2 to 3 years. And my co-defendants both took plea bargains. They didn't have a criminal record, and I already did. So, they pretty much got time served and felony charges. But I was so adamant I didn't do anything wrong. I knew that their goal was, it wasn't just me that helped start the Mongols and anything, but I was the kind of, they thought I was, they thought it was just me, and they thought getting rid of me would get rid of the Mongols. And so they really came after me really hard to try and keep us out of the state. And thankfully it didn't work out. But that's when I decided. So, like I said, there was informants in the chapter, which I still didn't know about yet. So anytime I came around, they would tell on me, I'd go back to jail. So that's when I decided that I was going to move to San Diego. I figured I'm a brand new Mongol. San Diego members I'd met, most of them were also white dudes and younger, and like kind of my age. And their president was a super well-known Mongol that was very respected. And I said, you know what, if I'm going to learn from anybody, I want to learn under him. And so I went down there and tried to learn more about this club life.
So when you stepped away, was there any like certain event that happened that made you just be like, you know what, I've had enough of this shit? Or was it just kind of a culmination of things throughout your tenure with the club? What was kind of like that deciding factor?
Yeah, there's quite a few things, man. There was a lot of political stuff going on with little Dave at the time. He had been thrown out. He was being labeled a rat and put out bad.
Right. I heard that somewhat of a recording with him and his wife or something like that. Or
Yeah, I
girlfriend.
mean, it wasn't a good look. It was very unfortunate that it all played out. And at the time, like I said, I was tight with Dave, but I heard the same recording too, and I wasn't sure what to think either. So, and he was out bad, so I stopped talking to Dave. But people knew I was tight with him, so you can imagine that there was some concerns there. And then on top of that, there was a pretty big value a power vacuum, and it started being rumored that I was going to run for national president, and the leadership there weren't very happy with that, right? And I'm not saying that's an issue or reason things happen, but it was people were treating me different because of it. They changed some rules so that they made sure I couldn't run for P. So the writing was kind of on the wall politically wise, but then at the same time, I had brought a guy into the club that I was really, really tight with, and he'd been asking to join forever. And he was a young kid with a lot going for him, man. And I really didn't want him to join this club, and I ended up letting him do it, and he ended up getting killed. And so, just the pressure and the stress of knowing that, everyone wants to be a president, everyone wants to be a boss, and they don't realize the stuff that comes with that.
Yeah.
And that hit me really hard, man, and there was actually 2 in the same year. The other guy was in a different club, but he had left the Outlaws and he was trying to join the Mongols, and we had a rule we wouldn't take ex-Outlaws. So I helped him join another club, and then he was killed for joining that club. So a lot of really, really heavy things on my plate with that type of stuff. Then there was the political stuff. And then honestly, man, just the whole landscape of the club world had changed so much.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the day, if you wanted to be in a major 1%er club, you were most likely the local tough guy that everyone already knew. You already had that reputation, and now it's like, you want to join a club, as long as you're willing to go through the steps, you can likely join. So, and I mean, that is what it is. That's every club pretty much. So I think with that really watered down the brotherhood. I think a lot of people wanted recognition without putting in the work. There was a lot of jealousy for people that were putting in the work and getting recognition. And
all things that these kind of clubs, I think, were founded upon by avoiding, like just
absolutely.
It just kind of,
and there are also inherent issues with getting large too, right? I mean, if you're an organization that's that big, you're absolutely inherently have power structure struggles and cliques and all this stupid shit. And so a lot of that started happening too. And I just decided, I was watching this train move in this direction, and with everything I got, I was trying to pull it back and keep it with the traditions, values that I was raised on, and the program I was running. And I didn't feel like the membership wanted it. So I was like, well, then I'm just doing this for me at this point, At first I thought, oh, I'm fighting to keep tradition and value around. But if the newer membership didn't want that, then why was I doing it? Mm-hmm. So I actually took a step down. I initially retired, and I was retired in good standing, was glad to keep my patch. But within 2 months, they switched my status to out bad, and that was it.
Well, since they switched it out bad, did you have to go through the process of like covering up any ink that represented the Mongols and stuff like
You
that?
know what? I think this was kind of some controversy that came up too, is when I was retired in good standings, I started covering up my tattoos. And some of the membership saw that as disrespectful. But to me, I didn't want to represent myself as something I wasn't anymore. And it was definitely no disrespect towards a club. I still had some other club stuff, but the very visible club stuff, I didn't think was fair to the members that were still being active and flying the flag, that I was out there claiming to be something that I no longer was. Plus, it was a transition in my life. I was moving on and putting it behind me. So I actually cover out, like I have that big Mongols tattoo on the back of my head. That's pretty infamous tattoo. It's all over the internet, and I covered that up and it ruffled some feathers. But for me, man, I work. I work in social work. I'm a mental health therapist, so I work with probation officers and judges. And it was just, man, I'm almost 42 years old. It got to the point where I thought it was probably a better move to cover it up.
Mhm.
But as far as being out bad, nothing negative came with it outside of, you're on no contact once you're out bad. So a lot of people that I was tight with stopped talking to me. Not just that, and I know we don't do things for clout in this world, but I'd started a lot of chapters and had a lot of done a lot of things in a lot of areas, and to have that kind of erased from the history books is a bummer. But
Yeah, I mean, it is hard. It's a lot of hard work. It's blood, sweat, and tears, and to not at least be acknowledged for that in some kind of way, I can see where that would, rub you the wrong way.
well, or the chapters having a 10 or 15-year anniversary and it's a chapter I started or stuff like that. Um, that's the part that just bums me out sometimes. But I've been saying to a lot of people, you know what, I don't regret a thing. I loved being in the club. I enjoyed my time with it, but I'm also very happy with it being behind me and where my life's at now. So it was time to move on.
Yeah. And you still ride, you still got a club, but it's a totally different style landscape. LTR, I think is the name of it, lift train ride.
Yes, we don't even call ourselves a club, but lack of a better term for sure. But so one of the things when I was in regional leadership with the Mongols, I had come up with some rules, and like no meth was one of them. Everyone had to have full-time jobs, visible means of income, trying to keep everyone out of jail, right, and keep
Right.
everyone on the right track. And as that progressed, we started really kind of getting into physical health and people being prepared. And so I had a rule that everyone in our region had to work out a minimum of 3 days a week. So when I left, one of the things I got put out bad for was my chapter, the chapter I was in. One of the main members, he had just gotten into it with an outlaw, and the outlaw had pressed charges on him, which it very against our protocol and our rules, but he did it. And so instead of taking it to trial because he was guilty of it, he would have lost. He took a plea bargain, and 2 years of that plea bargain was non-association. Well, his blood brother was in our chapter, his roommate and his coworker were all in the same chapter. And so when he got put on non-association and I retired, they decided, you know what, we're going to step down too. And in the Mongols, if you quit before being in for 10 years, you're automatically out in bad standing. So I was really advocating for them to be put out in good standings or just be out for the time being, just because of the fact that, it was club against club. His crime was, club related. And if he wasn't on non-association, they probably all would have stuck around. But I don't know if it was a political move or if it was just people trying to follow the rules. I think we could argue both sides, but either way, they put them out bad, and they called me and they said, "Hey, you're still in good standings, but your guys are out bad. And if you get caught hanging out with them, you're going to be out bad too." So, I'm a man and I don't lie to people. And I just straight up and said, "Hey, these are the guys I work out with and do jujitsu with. And these are some of my closest friends. So I'm going to keep hanging with them." And they said, "Well, we hate to hear that, but that puts you out bad." And so we all left together, essentially. I mean, on different levels, but we all left around the same time. And we just kept riding together. So, like I said, we continue to follow a lot of those same rules that we had. And then on top of just riding motorcycles and working out, some of the guys started getting into stick and knife fighting with me. I got some of the guys to start doing jujitsu with me. Some of the guys do boxing and other stuff. So we just try to make it more of a healthy, positive thing. Essentially, we took all the things I learned for my 15 years in club life and dropped what we didn't need and kept what we could. And without politics and beef with other clubs and all those big issues that we don't have to deal with, I think it kind of boils it down to a lot more of what traditional clubs were started for, which is the brotherhood and the family aspect. Like we get together for meetings, but all we talk about is where our next run's going to be. And we plan weekend rides, and we just spend time riding on the road and hanging out with each other and laughing a lot, partying and working out.
Makes it a little bit more enjoyable.
It's awesome, man. It's absolutely cool.
There's something to be said about that line, "Heavy lies the head that wears the crown." I mean, when you have these aspirations to be at the top of the mountain or whatever, that comes with a lot of stuff that a lot of people usually aren't prepared for, and if you look, through history, whether it's the mafia or whatever. I mean, guys don't typically last long at the top. You can count on one hand guys that's really had a successful run that didn't, die in prison. I mean, it's not
for sure. When that's actually so so I started that state rep program, so I was really tight with all the other state reps, and I had a lot of support out of in California too, but I obviously had a bigger support outside of the state or outside of California. So when people were asking me to run for national P, I'd always say no, and I'm not trying to make it sound like I even had a chance. Who knows? But I said no because I used to tell the guys, look out, we're at an all members meeting, look at this whole room. Who out there was ever a national P? No one, right? They're dead or in jail or thrown out,
Yeah.
And I didn't want that to be me. I didn't want that to be, my club career. And things happen the way they happen anyways. But exactly right. Like anyone that wants that position isn't the guy for the job.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like I said, it's very few. I mean, obviously Sonny Barger comes to mind, for someone that was able to kind of be that figurehead and stay out of prison for the most part. He did do some time.
Yeah, a lot of issues with it too, right?
Yeah.
And then a lot of internal stuff and a lot of hate from guys in the club, and just so much that comes with it. It's hard to be just the brother that you want to be when you're in politics. And actually, some of the best advice I ever got was to stay out of politics when I joined this club. And you know what? The only issues I had in this club were when I got involved in politics. But on the flip side, if you're not going to stand up and stick up for yourself and your brothers who are, and like I said, usually the guys in the positions that become are because they're doing good at it, not because they want it. Like I helped develop that program, so then I knew it really well. So then I felt like I did good at leadership and I ran a tight program. So I kept getting voted back in that position. But then, you're in a position like that, you really can't avoid politics for too long. So
right. Did you watch Sons of Anarchy when it was on air?
I did.
Do you think that maybe sent like an influx of people interested in looking to join?
Absolutely.
After that?
And I also think so. Like I was talking about before, how a lot of people want to be say I'm the president or the first whatever they had first. Not there's so many people. There's so I honestly think that influenced a lot of people that wanted clout or recognition, but they for no other reason other than that. So yeah, they want the president patch or the president tab. They want to tell the girls at the bar that they're the Jax Teller.
Yeah. I mean, what did you think about the show overall? I mean, obviously there's it's TV, so you got to take some things with a grain of salt. I mean, I don't know how many people you can kill in a small town like Charming and nobody.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the most ridiculous things that I seen in that whole thing was it was after Half Sack had gotten killed. So that was been right after season 2, the beginning of season 3. They was at his funeral and they had some guys run by and shoot him. I think they shot one of the cops, Hale.
Oh,
and
that's
Jack shot him, grabbed the guy, and literally beat him to fucking death on the sidewalk and is out of jail the next day. I mean, like, I don't know what world people think that would be okay, but it's not. That don't happen. You go to
traveling to Ireland and tracking down his kidnapped son. No, I love motorcycles, man, and no bullshit. What brought me into the motorcycle world is because I love riding motorcycles. And so I've watched every dumb show that's ever been out there around two wheels, and whether it was Devil's Ride or any of those cheesy, terrible show. Sons of Anarchy, actually thought it was good. It was a soap opera, right? It was just but it was about motorcycles, so I loved it. If I watched it thinking, is this supposed to be period correct, I would have hated it. Right. But if I watched it for what it was, which was entertainment value and about clubs and guys on bikes, I enjoyed it. I do think a lot of negative stuff came with it. However, there was a positive. When I joined motorcycle clubs, it was always the dirty, grungy guys, and chicks didn't dig it. And after Sons of Anarchy, girls started liking motorcycle club guys, so that was cool.
Well, I like that show because kind of a lot like Sopranos, you had a different cast of characters in there. So obviously, you had guys that looked a little more grungy, like Tig and Bobby, and then Opie as time went on, he had the huge beard. But then you had your guys like Jax and Perlman. Seemed pretty straight laced through the whole thing. He didn't really have too much of a.
And that's really consistent with motorcycle clubs now, right? There's that old generation, and then there's a lot of newer guys that are either into the clean cut, like more straightforward image, or the younger guys that like that old school grunt. So there's always that balance for sure.
And I mean, it was a wonderful show. I mean, I take nothing. I loved it. I remember I was sitting in the OBGYN office with my wife, and I knew who Kurt Sutter was because I was a huge fan of that TV show, The Shield.
Okay.
He wrote a lot of the episodes on that. So I seen that he was doing it. And I remember, so I was like, all right, this is going to be a good show. And my wife was pregnant when the first season aired. And so we actually made an agreement that if it was a boy, we were going to name him Jax. If it was a girl, we were going to name it Gemma. And it wound up being a boy. So that's my son's name, is Jax, from the TV show. So
Oh, I thought, I thought it was cool of him to, he's doing a show that's basically loosely based off the Hells Angels, right? So there was a lot of ex and active Hells Angels on the show.
oh yeah,
There was a lot of Vagos as extras. Like, I mean, they tried to, that part I thought was cool. They're taken from the community, try giving back to the community.
yeah.
I personally like Mayans a lot better, but just as show writing, I know it's going to sound funny, right? Because Mayans are supposed to be the Mongols, and you think I'm going to have favoritism to it. But just as a show itself, I like the Mayans quite a bit better. But I liked them both.
Yeah, I like the Mayans too. I think probably if Mayans would have been first, I'd have liked the Mayans first, just because Sons of Anarchy are first. It's kind of like, that first experience, you kind of favored that a little bit. But I mean, yeah, you're right. There was a number of Hells Angels in there. Sonny Barger was in there as Lenny the Pimp. Chuck Zito came in later on and played a role.
Happy was an active Hells Angel.
Yeah,
I
Happy.
believe.
Yeah, what's that? David LaBrava. That's his real
Yeah,
name.
yeah. I don't believe he is in anymore, but I mean, he was during the time.
That other guy, I think he is still active. He didn't say much. He was in the later seasons.
Rusty.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think he's still active, if I'm not mistaken. I don't want to.
Most likely, he was around the time I was still in. He was still in. The
So
cool thing about Mayans is, so a lot of people don't know, is the main rider, Elton James. He comes from the hardcore crew and the punk rock scene, and so a lot of the guys, that there's an old crew back there called FSU that started in Boston, and a lot of the initial FSU guys joined the Outlaws, and they were kind of like that newer generation that went from punk rock hardcore scene to the biker. So they kind of kicked off that funnel, because that happens everywhere now. So there's a lot of guys on Mayans that are from the punk rock scene or the hardcore scene, and like a lot of like dudes from the music scene that I knew from touring in bands and growing up that I see on that show too. So it might be part of the reason I like it too, because it's a lot of nostalgia and seeing old homies and stuff.
right, yeah. I mean, it was a wonderful show. I know they've been talks to do a movie or maybe revitalize it in some way. I mean, hopefully they do. I know Kurt Sutter kind of got ousted by Disney in the middle of one of the.
There's rumor that he's working on something now, from what I just was told recently. Whether it's some sort of prequel or who knows, but that's what the rumor is.
Yeah, the first 9 prequel has been rumored for quite a long time, and they would go back and obviously show the origin stories with all the older guys. It'd be a hit, I think, whatever they did. I mean, it was.
Well, and that's the heyday of biker culture, man. I mean, all the old dudes I met, every book I've ever read, the time to be a biker was in the 60s and 70s, man. These guys, they're getting in bar fights and they're going to jail for 2 days and getting released. Their cost of living's low. Most of them don't have jobs. They're just traveling the country on motorcycles, partying and hanging out with minimal consequences, legal consequences. Obviously, people were still getting killed, but I mean, it seemed like the heyday of the biker scene, right? Like that. That's when everyone thinks of motorcycle clubs. That's what we all think of. We're just dudes doing whatever the heck they want, traveling with their friends and having fun. So I think anything on that period would be great, because that was the good times.
And that Hollister riot that kind of spawned that whole 1%er thing. I remember that guy that came on to the news. He's like, look, 99, percent of bikers are good law abiding citizens. So it's like they just grabbed what he gave them and just held on to it. And I thought that was brilliant marketing by that in general, just to hold on to that one. All right, fuck it, we'll take that 1%. We'll be.
It's cool. I think where it bit him in the ass, because I mean, that's not even necessarily what it means anymore, but I get where it came from. But what bit him in the ass is that's what law enforcement says in every trial across country is, well, see, that means they're criminals. And nowadays with the legal system the way it is, there's very few people in motorcycle clubs that are doing overtly illegal shit on a regular basis, right? Most, especially like you said, with Sons of Anarchy, this different generation, most of these guys have families and good jobs and careers, and they're not living that type of lifestyle. But there's still some law enforcement seems to believe that things are still like it was in the 60s.
Yeah, it essentially became a target for them to easily pick out. Oh, they got the diamond patch, they got the 1%. Let's take another look. So
right,
it was cool the way it started in the beginning, but ultimately it wound up being, I think more hurtful than helpful in the long run. So you actually start, once you retire, you go, you do the live train ride, but you actually started doing some counseling. Tell us how you got into that. And I believe there was a story where you were actually recognized, like they weren't sure about even letting you get involved with doing that. Didn't like a cop from your past recognize you or something like that?
Yeah, there a couple times. So around when I came home from San Diego after Black Rain, I think I went to jail 2 more times for associating. And that one of the last times I was in there, one of the jail, I was going back to the same jail the whole time, Lane County, 23.5-hour lockdown. And one of the jail guards had recognized me. He goes, man, I can't believe you're back here. And I was like, blowing him off. What are you talking about? He's like, dude, he goes, look around. You're not that guy. You shouldn't be here. And it really sunk in with me, where a lot of these dudes were struggling with homelessness and addiction and like out committing crimes. And here I was because I was hanging out with the motorcycle club. And it really made me think like what I wanted to do with my life, how long, so here it was over a year where I was just going back and forth, back and forth. And I was like, how long can I keep up just going back and forth to jail all the time? And so I really started trying to consider my options and things that I could do. And like I said, my family was all teachers and I couldn't be a teacher because I had a felony on my record. But I wanted to do something where I was working with people and had a good influence. And there's a Mongol that goes by the name Richie Rich that has his PhD in clinical psychology. He's really big in like drug and alcohol counseling scene and working with inmates. And so I was like, hey, you know what, if Richie can do it, I could probably do it. And I got a lot of advice and guidance from Richie. And I started going back to school in 2008 or 2009. And I was just going to do my 2-year drug and alcohol certificate. But about a year and a half in, I fell in love with psychology. I went like headfirst into psychology. I loved it. And I also started thinking, listen, man, I'm a felon with head and face tattoos. I need more than a 2-year degree. So I went from the community college to Whittier College in Los Angeles. And then I transferred back to Oregon and was at Willamette University. And then I got my bachelor's degree from George Fox University. And then I went straight to my master's in social work, which I got from George Fox in Portland. Where the few times it kind of bit me was the very last semester of graduate school. We had to do different internships, and this was my last internship. And it was the internship where I was hoping would turn into a job because it's really what I wanted to do. I was going to be a therapist for kids that were in juvenile hall. So it was the kids it was called McLaren, but it's the kids detention center. And so I do the interviews, everything's going great. I get hired and they say, okay, well, here's where you're trained. Here's the paperwork, follow this address to your training next week, show up for training. And then, you just start getting going. So I found the address, no idea where it was or anything. And I pull up and I look up and it's the Oregon State Police Academy. It's where this training is going to be. So every cop, every age sheriff, everything is there, right? And I'm in my head thinking, you know what? I'm being arrogant. These guys don't know who I am. I'm not that important, not a big deal. So I start walking through the parking lot. And the very first guy I know now, he was the chief of police. And he just stopped and he's staring at me. And I remember I texted my wife and I was like, this can't be good. Anytime I was there for one full day, but anytime I'd even get up to take a leak, if I walked through the hall, like it was like a record skipped, everyone's staring at me. I mean, looking back, there was probably a room where they were teaching about me. You know what I mean? Yeah. So they pulled me out and questioned me and, hey, are you in this motorcycle club? And I was upfront about all of it. I said, yeah, absolutely. I'm a Mongol, and here's why I don't think it matters, and here's why I think it actually, in fact, it could help. And they were pretty cool about it, but they fired me. But so I got an attorney and I sued him, and I won. But I was in court for, several months. It was in all the local papers. And so it was kind of a hard time finding a job when they're like, hey, this is that guy that's a Mongol that just sued the state.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was one of the things that led me to moving out here to the Midwest, or at least to kind of try and start something fresh somewhere else. But that was one time. And then right after moving out here in the Midwest, I got a job doing just traditional mental health therapy and then substance abuse counseling. And I was at a conference for substance abuse counselors, and it was one of those where like you could pick a different room and they're teaching different stuff. And there was one called Outlaw Motorcycle Gangs, and I should have just avoided it. But in my head, I'm like, ooh, I'm interested. I'm wondering what I'm like, man, I just moved to Illinois. There's no way anyone out here knows who I am, And I go in there, and the guy that's running it, he's just staring at me. And I'm still self-talk, like, he doesn't know who you are, dude. Calm down. He closes his computer and storms off. And this other cop gets up there and says, oh, Detective Green had to leave for an emergency. And I'm thinking, oh, that's weird, but whatever. Next class, they pull me right out, and apparently Detective Green, who's the head of the Outlaw Motorcycle Gang Investigators Unit, is partners with Detective Burrows, which is one of the cops that I attempted to run off the road. So there was that connection.
Oh,
so they were pissed. So they tried to get me fired from my job. They called the jiu-jitsu gym I trained at. They came to the local police department. I mean, they tried everything they could to get me out of here. In fact, they even went through there's a couple guys that train at the gym that, are ex-cops or cops. They went through the Facebook and would not notify any of them, like, hey, you can't train at the same gym as him. And it was pretty crazy.
So, I mean, it's kind of, it's really weird that you have someone that has been through, like you said, altogether, I'm assuming roughly close to 20 plus years, maybe more, in this type of culture, growing up in these type of environments, experiencing everything that you experience, that actually wants to help and lend that, experience to these young kids to keep them from doing that. And they don't want you anywhere near it. I mean, I get it to a point. They want to make sure you're not trying to infiltrate, to give information back to a club. But if you're out, that should be easily be able to be picked up. I mean, we all know there's informants or people that hang around
Right.
all the time. It should be easy to say, hey, is Mooch still out? Mooch is out. You know, we haven't seen him
Well,
in forever.
I wonder to the point what it matters, right? If you're teaching a class on outlaw motorcycle gangs, you think you know exactly what it's like, and why would it matter if a guy in the world sees it, right? That'd be like, you know, that'd be like me doing a teachers conference, but saying I don't want any teachers here because you don't want to see that I'm full of shit. And the, kind of the crazy part too about like the Oregon Youth Authority was they were convinced, you know, I said, well, hey, why does it matter that I'm in a motorcycle club? You know, one of the biggest things about being a therapist is you don't self disclose. So it's not like I'm going to go, I mean, the kids can read me, I get it, the tattoos, but I'm not going to go in there and say, hey, guess what? I'm a Mongol, I'm this and that. And they said, oh no, we think it's this like conspiracy where you're coming in here to recruit kids to join your gang. So do you think I went to school for 8 years to recruit junior or teenagers that don't even ride motorcycles for my motorcycle? Like, it's such an outlandish, crazy, like, I get on paper, that was their justification, but if you really think about it, it makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, if you really say it out loud like you just did, it makes no fucking sense whatsoever.
Yeah.
So you actually, you have a book coming out, is that correct? It's in the works right now?
Yeah, I got a book deal mid last year. So I got a ghostwriter that's helping me write it. I mean, I write a lot and stuff, but you know, I'm a social worker, and so you know, having a professional writer help me, you know, make sure that it flows and all the good stuff has been awesome. We also do stuff like this. I'll meet him on Zoom and tell stories, and he'll type it up, and then I'll proof it, and it goes back and forth, and then he checks with sources to make sure it's correct. And so it's been a really cool experience. But yeah, we're working on that. I'm hoping it's like by the end of summer, but honestly, I don't know how that stuff works.
Yeah, I mean, it is, writing books is not a fast process from people that I've spoke with. I have a lot of books behind me from guys that's been guests on the show, and you know, some people just went through publishing companies, maybe that can speed it along a little bit. Some people that self-published, I mean, you know, those experiences, they said they never even wanted to read a book again after they got done.
Right. And that's, I mean, I have a publisher behind it, and you know, there's an agent that comes with it, and a publicist and a marketing person. I mean, it's been cool. That takes a lot off my plate, right? Or like, you know, I've been going to different bike events and bike shows and stuff lately, and I hit up him, and I was like, hey man, why don't we make little handbills like back in the punk rock days? I can hand out flyers for people to sign up the mailing list, and then they pay for it. So I mean, it's been cool not having to do that stuff on my own. I could see how quick that would burn you out if you were doing it on your own, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And you actually have your own podcast, well, Mondays with Mooch.
Yeah, I don't do it like super active, but my initial idea, I really wanted to do it with my twin brother at first. That's him behind me. We joined at the same time. Obviously, we're twins. We've done a lot of stuff together. And one thing that we were always well known for is when we tell stories, it's a lot of him questioning what I say or vice versa, and joking and you know, shit talking. And it's always been really entertaining. And people are always like, oh, you should take your show on the road. So my initial goal was to do that. However, he was still active in the club when I left, and we didn't want to put him in a bad spot. He has since retired, but he's in good standings, and so he can't like be doing public stuff with me, or and I just don't want to affect his status in the club. So then I just decided, okay, well, I guess I just want to. I started it out. I rode to Oregon and back. I had a full spinal fusion in 2018, and they told me I couldn't ride motorcycles anymore. So that was kind of my goal, to want to healed up to ride cross country. So I made a YouTube video out of that, and it had some popularity. I mean, relative for what it was, but you know, it did pretty well. And so I just started kind of putting out content. And the first few videos were like me riding and some product reviews, but then I really got into just kind of telling my story. And so some of it's just me talking, and the ones I like is when I have someone else come on, and we're just talking about, you know, how we met or how their story intersects with mine and stuff like that. So it's been really cool, but you know, I'm not really consistent with it. It's like when I'm like, hey, this will be fun, or let's talk to so-and-so. I'm still not super comfortable doing the ones by myself. So I keep having these ideas, and then I don't finish them because I don't like it.
Oh man, I've got so many like half scripts that I started writing that I didn't have anybody to necessarily talk with it about me, but I don't like the idea of just me talking. I don't feel like I'm that interesting. I need guys or women or whoever, you know, to bounce the conversation off of.
But what's funny is my most viewed video on there is the one where I was by myself. So, but you know, on top of that, I mean, there's a lot to that too. I mean, that was the one where I specifically talked about club stuff, and I use a club name. I normally don't put club stuff in my titles because I'm not trying to get views from that. You know, I'm like, even my book, you know, initially I was against guys from the biker world that write books, and I am for the fact that your whole story is about your club, right? Because then to me, that's profiting off the patch. You're making money off the patch. If you know, if my book was just like so and so Mongol, then yeah, I'd probably be making money. But you know, my story is a lot more than my book. Obviously, we've already gone through a lot of the other stuff I've done. And so I want my podcast to reflect that. I want it to be more than just club stuff, or especially the one specific club. And I don't want to get views by using a club name. So if it's relevant, I will. Like when I said how I joined the Vagos, that was obviously the title because that's what happened, right?
Right.
But for the most part, I try and shy away from that and just kind of do stuff naturally as it pops up.
Well, you have a wife that you credit to helping you make some of these decisions to walk away from the club. Your rehab that you mentioned earlier, because that was a pretty serious injury that you had. I mean, you credit as being her being, a lot of the reason you were able to do this. What what status do you put her at as, being that supportive companion throughout all this? Because sometimes that can go against you if you have a woman that's not necessarily supportive of, maybe your love of being in an MC, or that's not willing to stick around and, when times are tough. For someone that does that, I guess for the term you can just throw ride or die. I mean, what does she mean to you? Because I can tell just in your Facebook and Instagram post, I mean, she means a lot, but I just want to hear your words on.
Yeah, no, she's 100% my ride or die. She's my very best friend. And I think what's really cool is she's 10 years younger than me. And so she doesn't know anything about the punk rocker skinhead scene. She doesn't know about that past. But what benefited me, and I think what really played in my favor, is I was already pretty heavy into the club stuff when we met. And I've seen a lot of people that are in good relationships and married, and then they decide they want to join a club and they have all sorts of issues, right? Because your wife's used to be youing home every night or knowing where you're at. And so I kind of started on the opposite end of that and worked my way into a better relationship. So, she was always very supportive of the club because she knew it was something I loved. And when she started meeting the guys and the old ladies, she really, felt like part of the family too. But she's that person that, like, I would say my weakness is I can be way too kind or too forgiving. And she is, as sweet as she is, she'll be the one where I'll be like, hey, so-and-so's not that bad, right? She's like, remember this, this, and that. Like, but it's out of loyalty to me. Like, it's out of how much she cares for me. Like, cause she's an amazing person. So, yeah, I mean, during my surgery and everything, she's always been right there by my side. She's been, when I went through this really tough time deciding if it was time to leave the club and all that, she's been a support and there for me through everything. And I can imagine doing without her. So yeah, she means the world to me, man. And she actually just got her master's degree too. And yeah, she's doing really well. So
Yeah,
since meeting her, life's really, it's one of those things where I'm sure if anyone that's in a good relationship, you'll be like, oh, now I see why all the other ones didn't work.
yeah, no, exactly. Especially when you put a lot of time, to it, when times pass, you realize, I don't know if this could have come with anybody else, everything else would have fallen short. So when it's that one, and congratulations on both you guys for getting your master's. That's hard work, man. My wife actually got her master's and then went back and got her doctorate on top of it. She's also a school counselor.
That's awesome.
Like I told her when I was going to interview, I was like, you and this guy would, see eye to eye on a lot of stuff. I was like, she loves being able to help these kids and, send them on the right path and make sure that they, make the best choices, tries to get them prepped for college. I mean, a lot of kids, unfortunately, aren't going to have the availability to go to college. So she has to stress, like, tech schools. You can go to tech schools and get grants and not have to be out of pocket and not be in debt. So she loves it. I mean, she's been a lot of different things since we met. When I first met her, of all things, she worked for Target and I bought her like a gift certificate for Victoria's Secret, obviously out of the goodness of my heart.
Right. Yeah.
We go in there. Yeah. So we go in there and she strikes up a conversation with the manager. Next thing you know, she works there. She became a manager, worked there for years. Then she went to banking for a little while. Then we had my son. So she wanted something a little bit more during the day, not all the way to 5, 6 o'clock. So then she became a counselor. And, now she's got her summers off and I told my son when he gets to school where she's at, he's going to fucking hate it. Cause I hated when my mom worked.
For sure. I can only imagine, but that's rad. And it's a really cool overlap between, cause I did the same thing. I did a lot of retail and stuff like that. A personable person that's who usually gets into therapy, right? Because you have to have that type of mentality where people openly want to talk to you. They have that connection, that rapport. And a lot of times people, bartenders or realtor, people that are in real estate, stuff like, retail sales and stuff like that. There's a lot of similarities when it comes to that type of stuff.
Yeah, 100%. Well, Mooch, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you stopping by the show, man. I've had a blast. Obviously, we mentioned your book. You're hoping maybe late summer coming out. We mentioned your podcast. Is there anything else you'd like to plug before we get out of here?
No, just look me up on Instagram if you got any questions. It's OG __Mooch. But that's where like the mailing list stuff for my book is. Any of the Lift Train Ride merch and stuff, the links are on there. If anyone wants to pick that up, you know, anyone's welcome to support it and buy the shirts. You know, hopefully you support respectfully by working out and being healthy and being a positive person and being good to each other, but, you know, support. And then I'm always pretty open to answering and talking to people on social media. You know, I mean, if you ask something outlandish, I'm just going to tell you I'm not going to answer, but I'll still reply. But, you know, yeah, I'm happy to help in any way I can. So, you know, follow me on social media, hit me up, and I really appreciate all the support.
Yes, sir, man. Well, again, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. I'm glad you're able to share your story. Look forward to reading your book. So as soon as that gets a date, let us know, and maybe we'll have you back on to plug it and let everybody know when they can grab it.
Absolutely. That'd be great.
All right, my friend. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am Hollywood Wade. That was Mooch, and unfortunately, we are out of time. So tune in next week for an all new episode of Crime and Entertainment. Mooch, we appreciate it, my friend.
All right. See you guys.